The first sound was small enough that most people would have slept through it. A soft, deliberate click at the back door lock. The kind of sound a house makes 100 times a night if you're not listening for it. But Nathan Reeves was listening, because he had been listening for exactly this sound in exactly this way for 11 years, long before he ever became a father. If you're watching this, you already know what's coming. 3 strangers, 1 dark house, a sleeping 7-year-old down the hall, and a father who did not reach for the phone first. Stay to the end, because what happens in the next 10 minutes of this house is not what you expect from a man defending his home. And if stories about quiet fathers who turn out to be far more dangerous than anyone realizes are what you need this week, hit like and subscribe because we post one of these every single day. Nathan Reeves was 37 years old, and to every neighbor on Cobalt Street, he was simply the friendly single dad at number 14, who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and coached his daughter's soccer team badly, but enthusiastically. What almost none of them knew was that before he'd become a father, Nathan had spent 11 years as an Army combat engineer, specializing in urban breach and clear operations. The soldier sent in first to move through dark, unfamiliar structures where anyone might be waiting, and to do it without ever making a sound. He had left the service the year his daughter Sophie was born, not because the work had broken him, but because his wife had died of an aggressive cancer 18 months into Sophie's life, and Nathan had looked at his motherless toddler and understood with total clarity that there was no version of fatherhood that could survive another year of deployments. He took a job as a facilities manager for a mid-sized logistics company, a job with predictable hours and a badge that said nothing about what he used to be. And he built over 6 careful years, a life so ordinary that even he sometimes forgot what he had once been trained to do in the dark. There was a particular Saturday, back in early summer, that Nathan often returned to afterward as the last purely ordinary weekend before everything changed. He and Sophie had spent the whole morning at the small park 2 streets over, Nathan pushing her on the swing far longer than his arms wanted to keep going, Sophie shrieking with laughter and demanding higher every single time he tried to slow down, until they finally collapsed together on a park bench sharing a single overpriced ice cream cone, because he'd forgotten to bring cash for 2. It was a small, unremarkable morning, the kind that fills up most of a childhood without anyone marking it as significant. And Nathan would later understand that it was exactly the kind of morning he had rebuilt his entire life around protecting. Not the dramatic moments, but the 1,000 ordinary ones that only exist when nothing goes wrong. Sophie was 7 now, missing 1 front tooth, devoted to a stuffed rabbit named Captain Fluff, and possessed of the specific, unshakable confidence of a child who has never once doubted that her father could handle anything. Their house on Cobalt Street was small, and a little tired around the edges. The kind of house Nathan had bought because the mortgage was survivable on 1 income. But he had made it warm in all the ways that mattered. Sophie's crayon drawings taped along the hallway, a nightlight shaped like a moon in her room, a worn couch where they watched the same 3 animated movies on a loop most Friday nights. It was, by any measure, an unremarkable house on an unremarkable street, and that was precisely how Nathan had wanted it, right up until the night it stopped being safe. The trouble had actually started 3 weeks earlier, though Nathan hadn't recognized it as trouble at the time. A moving truck 2 doors down had drawn a small cluster of onlookers, and among them Nathan had noticed a man he didn't recognize walking slowly along the sidewalk, pausing at each house not to admire the neighborhood but to glance at windows, driveways, the presence or absence of dogs. Nathan filed it away the way his training had never fully let him stop filing things away. A data point, nothing more until it happened again 4 days later, a different man this time, walking the same slow appraising line down the opposite side of the street at dusk. By the 2nd week, Nathan had noticed enough small, repeated details. A white cargo van parked in a different spot each time, but always within sight of his driveway. A delivery drone mapping app icon he once glimpsed on a stranger's phone screen at the coffee shop 2 blocks over. To understand that Cobalt Street was being cased, methodically, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. He did not panic, because panic was the one reaction 11 years of training had spent methodically removing from his available responses. Instead, he called Officer Priya Anand, a family friend from Sophie's school who worked patrol out of the local precinct, and laid out the pattern for her with the same flat clarity he once used briefing a company commander. Anand did not dismiss him. She told him the department had, in fact, been tracking a string of nighttime residential burglaries across 3 adjacent neighborhoods over the past 2 months. Break-ins that occurred almost exclusively in homes where the occupants worked predictable hours and left predictable gaps. Homes, she said carefully, exactly like his, a single father whose work schedule was, if you watched long enough, entirely knowable. They're not picking houses at random, Nathan, she told him. They're picking patterns, and yours is an easy one to read. Anand couldn't put a patrol car on his street around the clock, not without more than a pattern to justify it, but she gave him her direct line, urged him to install real security measures, and told him one thing that stuck with him for days. If they do come, your job is to survive it and let us do ours, not to be a hero. Nathan took her advice seriously in his own particular way. He installed door and window sensors, replaced the flimsy strike plates on every exterior door with reinforced steel, and set up a small camera system that fed to his phone. The visible, sensible precautions of a careful single father, exactly the kind any neighbor would expect and none would think twice about. What he also did quietly, without ever telling Anand because he knew she would only worry, was something closer to what he used to do the night before a breach operation. He walked his own house, room by room in the dark, memorizing every creak in the floorboards, every door that stuck, every angle of cover, until he could move from Sophie's room to the kitchen and back with his eyes closed and not make a single sound. He was not preparing to hunt anyone. He told himself, quite honestly, that he was preparing to disappear, to become, if it ever came to it, the one thing in his own house that a burglar could not predict. There was one night, 10 days before the break-in, when Nathan very nearly called the whole plan off out of pure fear for what he might be inviting into his own house. He sat at the kitchen table long after Sophie was asleep, staring at the breaker panel switch he had just finished installing, seriously considering simply moving them both to his sister's apartment across town, until the pattern on Cobalt Street either resolved itself or moved elsewhere. It was Officer Anand, when he called her that night more for reassurance than information, who talked him back down, reminding him gently that fleeing without a plan on pure fear was exactly the kind of unplanned overcorrection that left families exposed in worse ways than staying and preparing properly ever would. You've already done the hard part, she told him. You noticed. Most people never even get that far. Trust what you built. Nathan chose to trust it, and spent that particular night sitting on the floor outside Sophie's door until almost 3 in the morning, listening to her breathe before he finally believed his own decision. He also made a plan for Sophie, framed the way he framed everything difficult for her as a game rather than a fear. He called it Rabbit's Hideout, and taught her that if she ever woke up at night to a sound that felt wrong, she was to grab Captain Fluff, slide silently under her bed to the reinforced hollow space behind the storage bins, where Nathan had quietly built a small hidden nook, and stay there, perfectly still and perfectly quiet, until she heard him say the word sunrise out loud, and not before. Sophie treated it with the delighted seriousness of a child handed a secret mission, insisting on practicing it 4 separate times over 2 weeks, timing herself with a plastic stopwatch, and Nathan found himself each time having to leave the room afterward and stand very still in the hallway for a minute, because watching his daughter cheerfully rehearse hiding from danger was the hardest thing he had done since the funeral. The break-in came on a Tuesday, 26 days after the first man had walked the sidewalk outside his window. It was 12:41 in the morning when the first sound reached him, the soft, deliberate click of a lock being defeated at the back door, not forced, not loud, the unmistakable sound of someone who had done this many times before. Nathan was awake within 2 seconds, the particular instant, total alertness of a man whose body had never fully unlearned it, and his first action was not to reach for a weapon or a phone. It was to reach for the breaker panel switch mounted discreetly inside his closet, the one he had installed himself 3 weeks earlier under the cover story of fixing a flickering circuit, and kill every light in the house at once, plunging Cobalt Street's number 14 into total, absolute darkness, and a darkness Nathan had spent 26 nights memorizing on purpose. He moved to Sophie's room first, in 11 silent seconds, and found her already stirring, and whispered the single word hideout against her ear before she had even fully opened her eyes. She was under the bed and folded into the hidden nook behind the storage bins in under 4 seconds. Captain Fluff clutched against her chest, her small body so still that Nathan, kneeling beside her for 1/2 second longer than he needed to, felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with training at all. "Sunrise," he whispered, the word that meant come out. "Not until you hear it from me." Then he moved back into the hallway and became, for the first time in 6 years, something closer to the man he had been trained to be than the man he had spent every day since choosing instead. He did not go hunting for a confrontation. He went hunting for information, moving through his own darkened house the way he had once moved through unfamiliar buildings on the other side of the world. Silent, low cataloging sound and shadow, counting footsteps that were not his own. He identified 2 intruders moving through the kitchen and living room within the first 90 seconds, their flashlight beams sweeping in the careless, confident pattern of men who believed the house was empty, and a third near the garage door, working slower, clearly serving as lookout. Nathan did not engage any of them directly. Instead, moving room to room ahead of their search pattern, he did 3 things in rapid, practiced sequence. He silently triggered the panic alert wired into his phone that sent Officer Annan's direct line an emergency ping with his address already attached. He quietly wedged the interior hallway door that led toward Sophie's room shut from the outside, using a length of cord he had pre-positioned there weeks earlier, sealing off that entire wing of the house without a sound. And he positioned himself in the narrow choke point of the kitchen doorway, the one spot in the house where a man moving through in the dark would have to pass within arm's reach. And he waited. The first intruder came through the doorway 8 minutes after the lock had clicked, moving with the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who assumed the house belonged entirely to him. And Nathan, using nothing but leverage, positioning, and the simple advantage of a man who could see the doorway's silhouette against a distant streetlight, while the intruder could see nothing at all, put him on the kitchen floor with a controlled takedown so quiet that the second intruder, 20 feet away in the living room, did not even register that anything had happened. Nathan held the first man face down, a knee light against his shoulder blade exactly as he had once been trained, and spoke for the first time that night, low and utterly calm, close to the man's ear. "You're going to lie very still," he said, "because the police are already 4 minutes out, and because there's a little girl in this house whose room you are never, ever getting anywhere near." The man, still disoriented from the sudden dark and the suddenness of the floor, went completely still. The second intruder found them almost by accident, drawn by the faint scrape of movement, and made the mistake of raising his flashlight directly into Nathan's face at close range, which told Nathan exactly where he was standing and did nothing at all to help the intruder, who now had to contend with a man whose eyes had spent 26 nights adjusting to exactly this kind of darkness. Nathan closed the distance in under 2 seconds, redirected the flashlight arm with a controlled motion that ended with the second man's own weight, carrying him into the kitchen counter, and had him zip-tied at the wrists with a set of cable restraints Nathan had, with grim practicality, kept coiled in his robe pocket every night for the last 3 weeks. 2 down. The third intruder, the lookout by the garage, heard just enough of the commotion to understand something had gone catastrophically wrong. And by the time he made the decision to run, red and blue light was already washing across the front windows, and Officer Anand's patrol unit, positioned 2 streets away on a hunch she'd been quietly acting on for a week, closed the distance before he reached the end of the driveway. Nathan did not leave the kitchen doorway until 2 officers were physically inside the house confirming the scene was secure, because 11 years of training had taught him that the most dangerous moment of any operation is the one right after you believe it's over. Only then did he walk at last back down the hallway, remove the cord from the door he had wedged shut, and kneel beside Sophie's bed to say quietly the word she had been waiting for in the dark. "Sunrise." She came out from behind the storage bins with Captain Fluff still clutched to her chest, her plastic stopwatch somehow still gripped in one small fist, and asked him, with the specific bluntness of a child processing something enormous through the only frame she had for it, whether this meant the rabbit's hideout game was actually real the whole time. Nathan told her yes, it always had been, and that she had done everything exactly right, and held her on the hallway floor for a long time after that, longer than either of them strictly needed, while officers moved quietly through the house behind them. What came out over the following days was worse, and in its own way better than Nathan had let himself imagine. The three men were part of a burglary crew responsible for at least 9 break-ins across the county over 2 months, using casing methods that specifically targeted single-parent households with predictable schedules. Information they gathered in part through a contact who worked at a local daycare and quietly sold enrollment and pickup time records for cash. Officer Anand told him, sitting across his kitchen table 2 days later with a folder she did not open all the way, that the daycare connection meant Sophie's own schedule had very likely been part of what drew them to Cobalt Street in the first place. And Nathan sat very still when she said it, the same total stillness Sophie had learned from him without ever being taught, and asked only whether the daycare had been notified and whether other families were being warned. It had, and they were, largely because of the documentation Nathan had quietly compiled over 3 weeks of watching the Watchers. The same instinct that had once made him good at his job now turned entirely toward the smallest, most ordinary kind of protection there was. Nathan told Sophie the fuller truth in careful pieces over the following week, the way you tell an enormous thing to a 7-year-old. Some bad people had tried to come into their house, and her hideout game had worked exactly like it was supposed to. And Daddy and the police had made sure they could never try it again. Sophie considered this with tremendous seriousness, then declared that Captain Fluff deserved a medal for staying so quiet. And Nathan, laughing for the first time in days, agreed completely and helped her cut one out of gold construction paper that afternoon. She seemed on the whole more proud than frightened, a fact that both relieved him and quietly undid him, because it meant she had trusted the dark and trusted him completely, without ever once needing to understand exactly how dangerous that night had actually been. Word moved through Cobalt Street quickly in the days after, the way it does on a street where everyone waves at everyone else's mail carrier, and Nathan found himself the subject of a startled, grateful kind of neighborhood attention he had never sought and didn't entirely know how to hold. A neighbor 2 houses down, whose own home had very nearly been hit the same week according to Officer Anand's briefing, stopped him at the mailbox to say quietly that she hadn't slept properly in a month and hadn't known who to ask for help. And Nathan spent the better part of that Saturday afternoon walking her through the same small, careful habits that had protected his own house. Vary the visible routine. Notice what repeats, build a plan before you ever need one. It was not something he'd planned to become, a man who taught his neighbors how to see the things he saw, but it turned out the instinct to protect a street was not so different from the instinct to protect a house. And both, it turned out, had never actually left him. On the Friday after the case closed, Nathan and Sophie sat on their worn couch for movie night exactly as they always had. Captain Fluff propped between them wearing his small gold paper medal, the nightlight moon glowing faintly down the hall, and Nathan let himself feel for the first time in nearly a month the particular kind of stillness that comes only after a threat has genuinely ended, rather than merely paused. He thought about the version of himself trained to move silently through unfamiliar darkness on the other side of the world, and the version of himself who cut gold medals out of construction paper for a stuffed rabbit, and understood, watching his daughter fall asleep against his shoulder halfway through the second movie, that they had never actually been 2 separate men at all. The training had not been a life he'd set aside to become a father.